Hello everyone! If you've been around the channel for a while, you'll know that at the start of 2021, I'd announced what I called the Guardsman Project, a project to refresh some eBay used Warhammer 40,000 miniatures into a sort of more generic science fiction force that I could equally use for Warhammer with friends who play it, and for other games, indie rule sets and stuff like the Nordic Weasel series. This sort of petered out between the birth of my son and some commission work that was taking up my time, and also just the fact that I wasn't feeling super inspired to batch paint any of the paint schemes that I'd come up with previously. However, recently, flipping through my MechWarrior RPG 2nd edition rules, I found the color plates in the middle, and I felt super inspired by the Davion Infantry paint scheme. So, this is going to be a tutorial on how to turn Warhammer 40,000 infantry models into Davion Infantry, to sort of give you the chance to play Battletech in a 28mm scale, more infantry and vehicle focused than battle mech focused, if you will. I think it's a super cool idea, and I hope you do too. Let's jump right into it now by getting the models ready for painting. There's a little bit of work that's going to go into this because they are used models, and also I want to make some adaptations to sort of differentiate them from that Imperial Guard look. So first of all, I want to change out the bases. That's just a personal preference thing. I want to strip off any flock that's already on there, and I want to remove as much of the paint as possible, just to make it easier for me to paint over top without losing any of the smaller details. To do that, I've got this jar of Simple Green. Simple Green is a cleaning product that I use and that strips off acrylic paint fairly well. It just turns the acrylic paint really soft. And I'm going to take my reference material. Reference material is pretty important for pretty much anything you're trying to paint if you want to have something to refer back to. And so I'm looking at this field uniform for Davion Infantry. I'm going to inspire myself from those colors. I'm going to add a visor, which is something I'd come up with in my brainstorming previously for the Guardsman project that I really like the look of. But otherwise, I'm going to stick pretty close to that color scheme from the MechWarrior RPG, just because I think it's a pretty practical color scheme while being kind of distinct and interesting. Using a stiff bristled cleaning brush after just a couple of days of soaking in the Simple Green, I managed to remove most of the paint and get them down to primer, and with a craft knife I could get most of them off their bases, but not a couple of them. One of them I broke his foot, so for the next one I decided to get my razor saw out. This is a new acquisition, but it is pretty useful and pretty good for this kind of crafting. This is my first time using the razor saw, but I got the hang of it fairly quickly, and I managed to only slightly break the base when I was prying it off with the knife afterwards. But whatever, this is easily fixed afterwards. I am going to be using washers for my bases because I like the weight they add, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But first we're going to work on the details that are going to make these look different from normal Imperial Guard models for Warhammer 40,000. So using the same razor saw, I'm going to cut very carefully, using slow strokes in one direction, through whatever that assembly on top of the las gun is supposed to be, to turn it into a bit of a little hollow sight. I'm going to cut off the end piece and just leave a little bit of barrel sticking out. And I'm just going to clean everything up with the edge of my hobby knife. I'm also going to be grinding off any of the eagle symbology because I'm not a huge fan of it. And ultimately giving these rifles a bit more of a streamlined, slightly shorter, though of course there's still that very oversized Games Workshop style, which I am kind of fond of, but a slightly shorter, slightly more practical looking sci-fi rifle appearance, with a very small optic on top that I think is a bit more practical looking once again. I'm also going to clean up any mold lines on the shoulder pads because those are large flat surfaces and the mold lines are going to show up quite clearly if I leave them on. I now want to make visors for these guys, and I want it to look a little neater than it did when I was working with green stuff on the previous models. That was time consuming already and takes even more time if you're trying to do it really neatly, which is not the idea for a big batch painted army of something. So instead, I'm going to grind off their faces mercilessly, and I'm going to be using pieces of paper cardstock as the visors. I'm just going to make sure I've got the right size, I'm going to make sure everything's smooth underneath, and I'm going to cut out little strips of cardstock that I'm going to insert into their face holes and use to serve as smooth, fairly regular visors, where the previous appearance of the Simple Green ones was a little uneven because I had to shape it all using tools and my fingers, which, you know, mixed results. I am also going to have one model that has an open visor because I think that's a little interesting and it's going to let me show off one character's face. So I might do that on more of the characters in the future as I'm making more of the army, but I just wanted to see how it looked and how feasible it was to do so. Now I used my calipers earlier to get a rough idea of the size of one of the faces of these models between their chin strap, which I'm going to leave showing, and the top of the helmet. So I'm going to measure for that, and I'm going to have to trim it again later because fitting these things in, you know, not all the models' faces are quite equal and so on, but I'd rather go bigger and cut down than, you know, to start too small and have to cut bigger, which doesn't really work that well. I use the inside of my tweezers to shape this so that I have something to bend it around that bends it relatively evenly and gives it kind of two angled creases thanks to the tapering shape of the tweezers, which just gives a little bit of, you know, if it's going to have creases, it gives it almost an intentional look. Whereas if I was folding it between my fingers, I'd just end up with something that's folded in the middle and the crease wouldn't be all that even. So it doesn't look great. So, grabbing onto all these as well as I can. It's quite hard, but, you know, I'm going to try and shape them into place on the visors, figure out how long they need to be, trim them. I'm going to bevel off the top corners on a lot of these because of just how they fit into the helmets. And I'm going to try and fold them in place with the tweezers, try and figure out how they sit before I go in and glue them. For the glue, I'm not using my thickest possible gel super glue, but I'm using a reasonably thick Gorilla super glue. I don't want the really thick stuff to sort of squeeze out the sides or do anything crazy, and I don't want it to affect the shape of the visor. I want to be able to just set the visor in place as I'm doing here. Try not to get super glue on your fingers, try to use the tweezers as much as you can, and just push the visor into its spot. Fold it as necessary with the tweezers to get it to look correctly, and seat it underneath the top face of that visor. Honestly, the less you fiddle with it, the better. But there you go. It just sits under the top edge of the visor and looks recessed in a way that I was having a hard time doing with the green stuff because it's so thick. And I think with green stuff, I wouldn't have been able to do this effect where just a little bit of the visor is sticking out below the lip of the helmet, but the model's face is still exposed. And this is done with just a very, very small amount of glue and a very thin strip of card. This whole process is a little fiddly, but it's not quite as bad as working with green stuff was, trying to get it all smooth and even, so this is definitely an improvement for my workflow when I'm looking at painting quite a few models in this style. Although I might not do this very, very thin strip open visor thing for too many of the grunts. That might be something reserved for personalities in the future. You know, sergeants, officers, and the like. With the visors seated in place, I turned my mind now to how the visors work, and I was thinking of an aviation helicopter pilot helmet style, where you've got that knob on the front that you use to raise and lower the visor. It's a fairly simple mechanism and fairly recognizable, and lets me add some detail to that forehead of the helmets where the eagle used to be. So using my razor saw, I'm just cutting a vertical strip down the middle of the helmet, right above the visor, which is going to be sort of that channel that the knob before the visors runs down on those aviation helmets. I would, in the future, probably use something a little bigger than a razor saw. I wanted to keep the detail fairly small to match with the scale of the miniatures, but this small slit was just too small. It filled in with primer, it filled in whatever, and it gave me quite a lot of trouble in the future. And I think just painting the impression of a channel there is going to be far more effective than actually cutting one in, to be honest, because the painting is what really shows off the channel on the finished models, whereas the actual cut hole is virtually non-existent. So, you know, maybe skip this step if you're doing this for yourself. Now I did need the knob that you're going to grab onto when you're moving the visor up and down, and I decided to try making it with just a little drop of super glue. I think I should have gone with my thickest possible gel super glue. I just didn't have any on hand right now, so I went in with this thinner super glue and I just applied the very delicate drop, boop, to make that sort of domed shape. It worked fairly well, but this one did settle out over time and flatten down a little bit. If you do need to remove some super glue, using a spare piece of paper or something to just draw some off works fairly well. Now, basing the models, I had mentioned I wanted to use washers rather than just straight up plastic 1-inch bases, so I'm using 1-inch washers, and I've 3D printed, using a resin 3D printer, some inserts that can go over top of the washers and make them look very smooth and sort of regular in shape. This is going to require a lot of super glue, so I recommend you use a respirator because you can develop an intolerance to super glue, and I feel like that would be a bit of a crimp in a hobbying sort of lifestyle if you couldn't be around super glue fumes. So I'm just closing those down, and I'm going to be applying some texture here. It's going to be a combination of sand, baking soda, and cat litter pebbles, little clay cat litter pebbles. You're going to want to use super glue to affix these, which is where the large amount of super glue fumes comes from, because if you tried to use water-based glue, like a white glue, you would end up with water soaking into the cat litter, and it'll just turn to soft clay, and it'll break apart. You know, ideally early, and less ideally after you've primed and painted the miniature. They're just going to start flaking off whenever you touch them with your thumbs. So use super glue so that everything sticks down, and the baking soda acts as a super glue activator. So start by putting on the cat litter, then putting on the sand, then putting on the baking soda at the end, because that'll activate the super glue and bond it all together. I do need to point out that these bases are a little over 1 inch because it's a 1-inch washer with an insert over top, but my understanding is that the new Warhammer rules don't really care too much about basing size, so a difference of a couple of millimeters between friends shouldn't be that much of an issue. If you do want to use these same inserts, I will have them up on Patreon as free downloads, the STLs for them anyway. So you could download them and print them yourself if you wanted to use them. I am also going to hopefully be able to sell them on Etsy in the future, but that's not available at the moment because I'm having some technical issues. But I will let you know if they go up for sale at all. I'm using some super glue here also to fill in where this character's foot broke off. I'm just putting it in where his toes are and then covering it with baking soda to solidify it and also sort of give the impression that he's just got mud on his boots. And now I'm using a very extra thin super glue and putting a drop on over top. This spreads out through the entire base and coats everything, activates the remainder of the super glue and makes sure that everything is very, very nicely bonded. It's a pretty nice trick. You could also just try blowing and shaking off all of the extra baking soda, but the idea is you just don't want anything loose when you go in priming and painting, because this is going to be a particle matter that'll prevent your primer from affixing well to the model itself. So making sure everything's sealed down is very important. I'm now going to put them all on painting bases or painting handles that I use to keep my hands free so that I can be painting the actual bases of the models underneath them, around the edges, around the sort of rim of the base, all that kind of stuff that's hard to reach if you're holding onto the model with your bare hands. There are painting handles available for sale all over the place, but these are super cheap to make, and I do have a tutorial. I'll put the link in the card right now. So if you do want to make those, you can. It's just some, chunks from a craft store. I'm sure they'd be at a dollar store as well, just little wooden bits. For actual priming, I'm taking these over to my airbrushing booth. I use a Badger Patriot 105 airbrush, and I use Vallejo surface primers. I use a black surface primer and a white surface primer normally. I find these apply really, really well through an airbrush. You can also use the airbrush without any load in it to just sort of blow off any extra dust. I was just demonstrating that. I didn't really have anything because I did the extra thin super glue trick. So not too much of an issue. But going in with these Vallejo surface primers, they have a very, very nice consistency when applied through an airbrush very thinly. They can be applied with a traditional hand brush as well. However, I would caution you that this can introduce a lot of bubbles into it. So make sure you're applying it very thinly and carefully and with a good quality brush that's not its bristles aren't skewiff and introducing any air while you're applying it. Otherwise, you're going to get a very uneven application. And you don't really want that with the primer. Through an airbrush, though, it goes on thin and it goes on neatly. So I start off with the black, and now I'm going in with the white Vallejo surface primer. I don't really have any white ink on hand right now, and the Vallejo surface primer applies very, very nicely over top of the black Vallejo surface primer. So using them in tandem just kind of works out for me here. If you had any issue with materials that you didn't think would prime well, like too much resin or something like that, maybe, if you've had issues with them before, maybe a second coat of primer wouldn't hurt. But otherwise, yeah, an ink will normally do well here for the zenithal highlight. And the zenithal highlight here, it does kind of show through your painting, but it's mostly so that I can see the relief on the miniatures while I'm painting them. I did make a little bit of a mistake here. In my plan, I wanted to have slings on the rifles. I find they add a lot of dynamism and they make the models pop out a little bit more, whereas just the rifle sort of hanging out, yeah, it's whatever, So I did want to put slings on. Unfortunately, I'd already primed the models. Oops. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to apply the slings after the fact to the models. I'm cutting out more strips of my thin cardstock. I'm trying to keep these fairly narrow. I think I ended up trimming them even narrower once I compared them to the models. But ultimately, test fit them, figure out the length that you want, and then cut them down to size. Cut them a little longer because I'm going to be making a loop at the end where the sling would buckle onto the rifle. So I put super glue on one end and tuck that super glued end just up under the arm somewhere. It doesn't really matter where it sticks. That's a hidden area. So as long as it gets stuck in there, we're good to go, Just fix it in place after you've cut it down to the right size. Here, yeah, you want to thin them down. I wanted them to look chunky so that they match the sort of general aesthetic of the miniatures without looking, I guess, so wide that the thinness of the paper stood out, because of course the paper is thin relative to the width of the sling, and it would look a little weird if they were super wide and super thin. So I think I struck a good balance here. And just glue them all into the armpits, and then once you've done that, we're going to be affixing the front end of the sling. Now, as I mentioned, I want the front end of the sling to look like it's buckled on, so I want a little bit of a loop there. I'm going to fold that up wherever the end of the rifle is. I'm going to snip even more once I've made sure I've got the exact right amount I want for the buckle, and put a little bit of super glue inside the loop. Closing that loop, you can do it with tweezers, you can do it with your fingers. Just try not to get too much glue on your fingers, otherwise the slings will stick to you, like we were having the issue earlier with the visors. But yeah, then add a dab of a relatively thick super glue that'll grab quickly and be a fairly strong bond, and just pull that sling back into place so that it is stuck to the underside of the barrel, looking as though it's got a sort of connection point. These lasguns do have bayonet lugs on some of them where I haven't broken them off, or where they weren't broken off previously, because these are a used lot of miniatures. So I sort of tucked it in behind that bayonet lug and used that as a reference point to try and make sure they were all in the right place. You can then use tweezers or some other method to pinch out any creases that are in it, because it is paper, so it creases a little bit, just to give everything a little bit of a smoother hanging look. And once those creases are pinched out and you got smooth slings, you can go back around and prime it back up again. And then you can start looking at picking out your paints. Now these are how the models look. You can see how the zenithal highlight highlights the details. It makes it easier if you have a hard time seeing small details on small models. So, you know, I do recommend doing that. And it can show through thin paints and give you a little bit of a highlighting effect. You know, mixed feelings on that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but whatever. I swatched out my colors on some previously painted bases because it's the same primer base and a little bit of texture. And once I decided how I wanted these models to look, I came up with the following colors, and hopefully you can follow along. I've got Vallejo NATO Green and Vallejo Stone Gray. The reason I'm using Vallejo paints and not my usual cheap paints is that for a large army with a uniform sort of color scheme, I want to keep everything uniform. So I'm using these paints because I can keep the exact same shades. So I got Burnt Umber and I've got Camouflage Gray-Green here from Vallejo now. Those are going to be the colors for the camouflage pattern on the fatigues. This is Camouflage Medium Brown, which I kind of like as just a spare brown with a warmish tint. And then I've got Amaranth Red, which is my go-to orange. It's not very red to me. I don't know if you think the same, but it's very orange to me. And then I do have cheap Artist Loft acrylics. The white and black Artist Loft acrylics are going to get quite a bit of use here because the armor is gray. And for the gray, I figured I could mix 1-to-1 and get something consistent across all the models easily. And then I've got blue and red Artist Loft. I'm going to fill in with other Artist Loft colors when I really need other colors, but we can move on to actually painting now, and hopefully that gives you an idea of the colors that I'm going to be working with. So for painting, right off the bat, I'm going to go with a fairly thick bristled, it's one of my older kind of cruddier brushes, but it's really good for covering large areas quickly. And I'm going to use that to slap on basically just the raw NATO Green. NATO Green is going to be the base for my fatigues, and I'm going to be building up with Stone Gray in order to highlight it. The reason I'm building up with Stone Gray is that it is actually a gray that's designed with a little bit of green in it, so it keeps some consistency in the highlights, keeps them green and not just like blown out by white. And I don't want to use a yellow for the highlights because I thought that would make it look too warm and would change the color too far away from the NATO Green. That's sort of very... I'm going for the 80s generic, you know, Western country olive drab fatigue style, or I guess at least the style we had in Canada anyway. So I want to keep that very olive green and not dilute it too much. For the armor itself, this is my cheap Artist Loft black and white. They're going to go together into a gray, relatively dark gray. I want to keep it not quite black, but very, very dark right now because I'm going to be highlighting up. And this whole process, I'm painting these guys without using any washes because I want the paint scheme to be very crisp. And if you've noticed the mistake here, keep it to yourself for now. I will get back to it. If you haven't, well, you'll see what it was. But yeah, I want to keep everything fairly crisp. I want to keep everything nice and, you know, intentional. And I find that washes can take that away. I also am trying to work on my skills as an actual painter. And I want to be able to paint the things sort of myself. If you want to use washes, absolutely. I think washes are a great way to do it. They can get you painting lots of models quickly, and they can get your models looking tabletop ready very fast, which can be super rewarding. If you do want to do that, don't start with dark colors like I'm doing here. Start with more like the mid-tone colors, and then put your wash on, and then put a highlight on afterwards. But that methodology has been covered in so many other tutorials, it's not really, I don't know, I didn't feel like it was worth covering for me necessarily. So now I'm going to go into the browns here. I'm going to be doing brown for the leather bits. I want some leather bits, not because it makes particularly much sense for science fiction settings, but because it makes a lot of sense for 80s science fiction settings, if that makes sense. Maybe they do use leather just because for some reason, you know, animals are sustainable in space. But anyway, I'm using leather because the brown is a warm color and it contrasts really nicely with the green and the gray, which are sort of cooler looking colors of the fatigues and of the armor. It's the same reason I'm going to be doing orange visors, although it also coincidentally, the orange visors match up with the orange canopies I paint on all of my Inner Sphere Battletech models. So it's got a little bit of consistency across the collection that way as well. Going in here, this is just basically burnt umber right off the bat on all the brown areas, and I'm going to be adding the other browns in as I increase the sort of lightness and continue highlighting up those areas, just to add a little bit of complexity and to brighten up that burnt umber, which is my darkest brown that I have. At this stage, working with a thick brush, you might make some mistakes and go over the lines, but that's fine. It's a thick brush. We can go back in and cover up afterwards, and the time saved by working with a thick brush more than makes up for the extra time you have to put in just sort of touching up the edges where you put a little bit of brown on something. Now I'm going to mix together color for the gloves, and I wanted to highlight this one because it's a little bit weird. I'm using the camouflage gray-green and the stone gray to mix a sort of tan color for the gloves. This is just purely a little point of highlight on the models. There wasn't really a color specified for the gloves, but if they were gray, they would be touching the gun and they wouldn't stand out. If they were green, it would look kind of lame, like you didn't have hands, I don't know. And if they were brown, I guess I could have done the dark brown, but I just wanted them to pop because the hands, it's so easy for them to get lost into this sort of design where they're between so many camouflaged bits. So I decided to go with khaki gloves, or tan gloves that is, because I thought tan gloves looks kind of workmanlike. And of course they had to be wearing gloves and not have exposed hands, because if you've ever run around crawling in the dirt a lot and grabbed hot rifles, you know why you want gloves. Now I'm going in with a slightly more precise brush. This is one of my DaVinci Maestros. I'm going to be mixing together some colors here in order to start highlighting up the green. That was the NATO green and the stone gray mixing together, and I'm making a bit of a wide gradient between the two, from a fairly pale color down to the normal NATO green. And I'm going to be working my way up through it in stages. I used 3 coats on these miniatures, so first coat was just NATO green. Second coat is about a 1-to-1 of stone gray and NATO green, maybe a little more NATO green. And last coat is maybe 2-to-1 stone gray to NATO green. So what this does, as I stick to the raised areas with each progressive highlighting pass, I guess, I bring myself closer to what I want the actual color of the model to be, and by doing it in stages like this, what I'm doing is I am actually making a gradient that's going to be really pleasing to the eye and makes everything look super smooth from tabletop distance, even with only 3 coats. So 3 coats doesn't take that long, I assure you, and the time you'd be spending waiting for a wash to dry anyway, you could be spending putting on your mid-tone coat. So, you know, seems worth it to me. For the gray armor, I'm applying this mid-tone pretty much everywhere, and there's my mistake. The helmet covers. I was about to paint the helmets on these guys, and I went, oh, right. The helmets are camouflage too. And honestly, it looks better that way, so I'm glad I figured this one out, and I fixed it afterwards. So I'm going to use the exact same technique that I've been using on the actual fatigues. I'm just putting on NATO green, then I'm going to bring it up to a NATO green and stone gray, and then I'm going to bring it up to an even more stone gray. I'm leaving the back box on the helmet clear and gray because I want that to be like a battery pack for the internal mechanisms of the helmet. I think that looks cool, so it's sort of swappable and it's separate from the helmet cover. So there you go, with a couple of coats of highlights, I now have a fairly smooth transition where I'm highlighting all of the raised areas of the combat fatigues and also of the weapons, and I'm going to start putting the camouflage over top of that. I didn't want to paint all of them at the same time because I want to also be shading the camouflage. So I'm going to be working between gray-green and burnt umber, starting with burnt umber, working my way up to gray-green across the actual camouflaged stripes. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to be mirroring the same highlighting scheme that I did on the fatigues underneath. So I'm laying on my stripes, first in burnt umber, and then I'm going to go back in over top of the areas that I highlighted in green and highlight them in brown as well to make it clear that these camouflage stripes are actually part of the garment. They are wrinkling in the exact same way as the garment underneath, they're raised in the same places, recessed in the same places, and are shaded. And this gives a lot of texture to the clothes and makes everything sort of tie together in a way that if I just applied the brown over top, it wouldn't necessarily. It would look a little flat. And we kind of saw that in one of my previous videos where I was demonstrating sort of doing a camouflage scheme as one of my test models, and I didn't do a highlighted camouflage, and it did look a little meh, you know? So we live and learn. I've decided this time I'm going to go in and I'm going to make a really dynamic as I can with the camouflage scheme. One of the things I was worried about with doing camouflage is it's going to be really drab, you know, and especially on small models, everything would blend together. It wouldn't look that good. So I'm trying to keep with bold colors, with bright highlights, and I'm trying to tie everything together in gradients so that everything looks smooth across the thing, and you can really distinguish that there is a camouflage scheme on there, and it's not just a muddy mass of brown and greens. So here I'm going in and I'm just picking out the areas that I previously painted, just the raised areas. You see I'm dabbing on that mixed highlighted version of my brown. That's the burnt umber and the gray-green mixed together, dabbing it onto just the raised areas, leaving the recessed areas burnt umber. Doing this, it's kind of just a question of trying to be fairly neat with my strokes because I don't want to blow out the camouflage pattern and I don't want to cover everything in brown or too many missed strokes. Still not too time consuming, especially with a fairly nice brush with a good point. Mixing in a little bit of stone gray now into the brown, I get my highest highlight, which I'm applying only onto areas that are raised and on upwards facing parts of the camouflage as best as I can, so that I'm getting the highest highlights of the camouflage in a thanks to the stone gray, similar tone to the rest of the green. I don't want them to blend together, I don't want it to be outright gray, but I do want it to be highlighted and keeping everything sort of unified as a color palette. Now I'm going to be going in and doing the visors and the details on these figures. For the visors, I've got my amaranth red, the same color I use for my canopies on my battle mechs, because it is a very nice orange, and I can't get an orange that vibrant with my cheap craft paints. It's a washed out yellow with a washed out red mixed together. It doesn't really do much. It makes a really bland orange. This amaranth red though, chef's kiss, really nice. So what I want to do is I want to get a high vis, sort of high contrast glasses style of visor. So I'm trying to make the reflection of a landscape in an orange lens. So I'm mixing burnt umber with my amaranth red to get a red tinted dark color for the landscape. And I'm sort of replicating the techniques that I used in previous videos where I was doing a true color reflection, but I'm doing it just in shades of orange. So after I've done the dark landscape at the bottom, I'm going in with a very light horizon line. So this is amaranth red and some white. I could have used a yellow to mix in to highlight up the orange, and I think it would have popped a little bit more. I might try that in the future, but this time around I just added white because I'm also keeping a fairly limited color palette. And then I go in with a little dot of white in the upper corner for the sun as part of the landscape. And the rest of the sky is filled out with basically just raw amaranth red. And then at the very bottom, I'm going in with a slightly lighter mix of umber and of amaranth red. So basically that horizontal center line of the visor should be a contrast between your darkest and your lightest colors. So that's your dark brown for the land and your lightest orange for the horizon line. And then you should be going fading towards a darker orange upwards and fading towards a lighter brown downwards. And that gives you a really nice dynamic look. I'm also going to do the same-ish onto the recessed visor, so that's basically just going to be even more drastic. I'm going basically from dark brown to bright orange in a very short distance, and I'm using the orange to highlight the light on the battery on the back of the helmet and the front and back of the holographic sight on the rifles. And this just adds some little pops of bright orange color that I really, really like. Finally, I'm putting some red on one tab and blue on the other tab of the cargo pant pockets as an homage to the Hammer Slammer's idea of having the sort of pull tabs for drugs for first aid on either side of the breastplate. I think that's kind of cool. Now I'm going to paint the face of my exposed face trooper. I've started out with a black paint, and then I'm going in with burnt umber to get a sort of warm brown undertone over top of the face area. So going in just fairly liberally, I'm leaving the inside of the mouth black, just so it's got a lot of contrast, and it'll stand out very well against the lips and teeth when I paint them in afterwards. Now a mix of Vallejo Amaranth Red and medium flesh tone helps bring a little bit of pink into that dark umber, and just lighten it up while keeping it pink and warm and red like the, blood vessels. Keep it flesh looking and really warm it up so the highlights go more towards yellow with a touch of red as I lighten up the skin tone. And I'm going to keep this to narrower and narrower areas as I mix a little bit more and a little bit more of this, so that I'm ending up with cheeks, bridge of the nose, and the bottom of the chin that really pop and have a really warm color standing out, but they're still based in the burnt umber, so still unified with the underlying color of all of these skin areas. The next thing I want to do is I want to highlight some of the details on the face, so I'm going in with a mixture of just the flesh tone and the amaranth red, and I'm touching the lower lip where the mouth is open, and then I'm taking a little bit of the flesh tone and mixing it with white to get an off-white and applying it to the teeth where they show under the top lip, to really give the impression of a guy who is yelling his heart out. This guy's, he looks kind of like he's falling backwards. Maybe he's been startled. Maybe you should have had your visor down and the explosion wouldn't have startled you, buddy. Anyway, I was going for something, a little bit of energy. So the mouth is clearly open and he is yelling his guts out. With that, I've got the face finished off, and I can move on to the next step here, which is painting the bases of the models. For the bases, I'm going to be going with a little bit more arid of a look. It's not that much more arid, but a little more arid than my usual temperate sort of woodland bases that I work with most often. These will still fit into a temperate setting, but I'm just sort of punching it up a little bit because I thought something a little warmer and a little brighter would contrast well with the green without making it look like they're wearing the wrong camouflage for the wrong environment. Not that that's not something people would do, but anyway, so I'm going in with, this is the cheapest brown paint I have, with just a touch of the gray-green and the camouflage medium brown added in to warm it up a little bit, because the cheap artist's loft paints are fine, but their color's a little thin. So just to warm things up and make it a little more dynamic, I mixed in a very, very small amount of my expensive paints. But you don't want to do too much of it because, they're expensive paints. They're not for bases. if you're cheap like me anyway. Using just the straight up artist loft paint, I then make the rocks brown instead of gray, because I thought that would look kind of cool and it would look like they blend in a little more. And then, using a really, really crappy brush with all its bristles busted, I'm taking stone gray and I'm lightly dry brushing it around the edges of the bases. This makes everything lighten towards the outside and stay dark under their feet, and gives the impression of it looking like there's a shadow under the figures. So it makes the bases look a little bit more interesting as well, for very, very little extra effort. Next up, I want to add some decals. The decals for the 6mm Battletech models work just fine on 28mm infantry. So I'm going to apply some gloss varnish here, or I did apply some gloss varnish at the time of the video you're looking at here. And I'm going to be applying Fighting Piranha Graphics decals. These are the decals that are made for the battle mechs, but of course they work just fine at this scale as well. And we're just going to put one arm patch on the right arm of every one of my figures to make it clear that they are soldiers of the Federated Suns. I'm getting a small container lid here that's flat on the bottom that I can put water into and use as my receptacle for water slide decals. I need a craft knife and not scissors for cutting out the water slide decals, and the reason for this is just they're very, very, very small, and scissors have a shearing effect. You know, the scissor blades come together and they push things up and down in opposite directions, and that'll pinch your paper and it'll fold your decals. So instead, use a sharp knife and just cut out a little square or circular, if you're way more dexterous than me, area around the decal and remove them from the water slide decal sheet. The decal will then go in water to soak and detach from its backing, and it'll become a little translucent decal, I guess, a little translucent image that you can then coax onto the models. Waterslide decals are super nice for adding a little bit of color and a little bit of detail that's too fine for painting freehand, or at least for me anyway. I'm sure someone could paint a really nice freehand starburst for the Federated Suns, but anyway. And I'm also going to cut a couple of them in half so it looks like they're half obscured by the pauldrons, so that they really blend in very well with the model afterwards. Using a brush with some fairly generous bristles, I'm just going to find the decal in the water where it's separated from its backing and lay it in place on the model itself. When you've decided that it's in the right place, soak off some of the water from your brush, which I do on my hand, you could do on a towel or something, and then use the brush to wick away water from on top of the decal. If you need to move it again, you can put more water on, it'll separate once again, and you can push it around, and then once again you can dry off the decal using the brush to wick away the water. When the decal is dry, it will be affixed relatively firmly to the model, but you may have some areas around the edges where, for example, if you cut a square like me, the corners might still be just glossy paper or something, or you may have areas where the printing didn't quite work. Sometimes there's little white spots on the decals here. Fighting Piranha Graphics are very high quality decals, but there's stuff that happens with everything. So, in those cases, easy enough to fix because we're working with known colors. This is another advantage of using the expensive paints rather than mixing my own paints. Very easy for me to just grab NATO green and slap it on around the edges of these decals to make them blend in. Of course, you could do that by mixing your own paints as well, but I'm just taking the advantages where I have them. And by using this to clean up the edges, I'm also just making sure there's less and less of the decal paper that is standing out as being a different texture than the model itself. The decal itself being a little bit of a different texture doesn't matter too much, it's a patch on the uniform, but yeah, the square bits of clear plastic around it can stand out a little bit. Now it's time to add some foliage to these models, and then afterwards we're going to put a matte varnish on, and that'll also help combine the textures of the decal and the miniature. But first, the foliage, because I want it to get the varnish as well and benefit from the same stuff. So I'm starting out with some static grass tufts. I bought these on eBay as a big lot. They're pretty nice. They're just little tufts, I guess. They stand up straight and they make for really tall grass patches. They're slightly different colored from my normal grass or static grass that I apply as foliage, but that's kind of a plus in some cases, I guess. It just makes them look like different plants and sort of adds some variety to the bases. And since I'm going for a slightly more arid looking base, this tall, straight grass tuft business I thought looked pretty appropriate to the biome that these soldiers were expected to be in. So, using super glue and tweezers, I affix some tufts all around, and then I'm going to blend those tufts in by adding my static grass afterwards. Because I get to add the static grass around the base of the grass tufts, it sort of hides them and eases the transition between the grass tuft and the base itself. I'm applying the glue here. This is Mod Podge matte. You could use pretty much any glue, but I wouldn't use a cheap craft glue because they can dry cloudy and that'll look like crap underneath. The Mod Podge, I know it dries clear, so I'm using Mod Podge. And I'm putting on my mixture of static grasses, and I'm leaving some patches of bare earth because I do want that slightly arid look. Finishing up the miniatures here, I'm going to apply a matte varnish, as I mentioned earlier. I apply these varnishes through my airbrush. I really, really like my airbrush. Strong recommend if you can get one, but I'll talk about materials later in a future video, but I do recommend an airbrush if you can. And then after the matte varnish, I'm going to go in with either the black acrylic paint, or if you want, more Vallejo surface primer, and just go around the edges of the bases and blacken them out. Either of those two things will give a sort of semi-gloss, very smooth appearance. Because I have a black flow acrylic, it's an already thinned acrylic, and it does smooth to a really nice semi-gloss surface. I do it after the varnish because I want to keep it kind of glossy. I think that looks nice around the edges of the miniatures. And then you have the finished product. And look at these. I really like them. This is definitely a look that I will be happy to carry over to the rest of the army. The challenge now is going to be making the armored fighting vehicles look interesting and Battletechy, because Warhammer has its own style, shall we say. So I'll be spending a while now trying to figure out how to modify those tanks to make them look more like what I would like them to look like. But in the meantime, I'll batch paint up some more of these guys and get the infantry done for the army over time in the background. The next video should be pretty interesting to those of you historical buffs who followed me around the time of the Spartans and Athenians videos. It's going to be more 15mm historical miniatures, hopefully coming soon, you know, TM, quote unquote. We'll see how soon that is, but hopefully sometime next month. One a month is about as good as I can get these days, but I'm pretty happy with it. Now it's time for the call to action. Any of you out there who are Battletech fans but have an old Warhammer army or can get a hold of some cheap Warhammer models, let's make 28mm Battletech a thing. Let's get some more Davion troops, or hey, some troops for House Karita, House Liao, whatever. We could do some 4th Succession War action. Send me some pictures on Instagram, Facebook, something like that. Let me know. Hashtag 28mm Battletech on Instagram, and I'll take a look at that and see what we've got. Maybe we could get some traction and get some battles going. If you enjoyed this video, if you have any questions about it, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you would like to support my channel, I do have a Patreon. Like I said, I'm going to put up the STLs for these bases on the Patreon as a free download. You don't need to actually pay me. You can go download them. The other free download I have there is my small city tiles for DBA. They're just very small scale, easily printable on an FDM printer. Cityscape tiles. And I did print and paint those in a previous video. Link is in the card. So, if you do want to check those out, they're also on my Patreon. Finally, thank you all once again for watching, and as usual, go play some games.